everybody, and welcome to another episode of Connect Conversations. Today's conversation is all about tools, supply chain, and it's brought to you as a part of Mobius Connect's ongoing YouTube series, Connect Conversations. I'm Kim Fugger, the manager of Mobius Connect, and I will be your moderator for today's session. First, I'd like to introduce our host, Ron Moore. He is a global reliability improvement expert. Hi, Ron, are you here with us?
I'm here.
Okay, well, before I pass the microphone directly over to you, I want to encourage our audience here today to submit any questions that you may have into the question panel of our Zoom account here today. And we will have Ron answer your questions live while we are on air. Your questions will be answered and aired anonymously, so no need to feel about getting called out directly. Ron is here to provide his advice and perspectives from his experiences and are here to help you. All right, Ron, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you now.
All righty. Well, thank you, and thanks to all who are out there listening. Today's session might be a bit short. I don't have Doug Plucknette with me to bounce ideas off of, and so it might be a little shorter than normal. And that might be a good thing. I'm not an expert on supply chain. I'd be the first to admit that. So if you have questions, I may or may not be able to answer them, but I'll do my best to give you a point of view, at least my point of view. I have a set of slides that I'd be happy to send Kim, and she can distribute to whoever wants them, on a couple of models. One is truly a chain, and it's Robert Parker, it's his model. And another is more focused on some of the particulars of how you might adjust your manufacturing process to support your customers and your products for optimal effect. So we're going to be talking about both those models in just a bit, and I'll share with you what I learned from those guys. Before we do that, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about the current so-called supply chain issues around the world and give you at least my perspective on what might be driving that. Again, I'm not an expert, but I just want to give you my point of view, and so feel free to disagree with that or question it or whatever. But I think the current problem that we have with supply chain, with the supply chain, that is getting the stuff you need in a timely way at a reasonable cost. I think it's in large measure, maybe not totally, but in large measure driven by COVID. You know, this COVID pandemic has driven folks to do things like lockdown. We've had folks isolated, we've had folks sick, we've had a lot of folks, way too many people dying. And so that's put a real huge constraint on the availability of labor to produce the products and maybe to some extent the services that we need. And at the same time, even before COVID hit, there was a ramp up or a huge increase in the demand for online or by online shoppers. They just order stuff online and have it delivered. Well, that demand has only intensified during COVID because people are home. They've maybe got money to spend, and they're not going out to restaurants. Hence, the restaurant and the entertainment industry has suffered a lot. But a lot of folks are taking that extra money. Now, not everybody has extra money. I get that part. But a lot of folks out there have a little extra money. And so they're buying more stuff online. Well, so we've got high demand. And at the same time, because of the labor shortage, we don't have enough folks making stuff, to put into the supply chain. And so there's a shortage of stuff. And not only that, if for example, you're making, I don't know, let's pick something, a cell phone. So you got chips maybe from Taiwan, you've got screens maybe from Indonesia, and I'm making this up, so I don't know where it's coming from, but different suppliers are making stuff that converges into the assembly of the cell phone, maybe the plastic case, the cables for the charger that go with it. All that stuff comes from different areas, and even their suppliers stuff comes from different areas. And you got this shortage of labor to make that stuff that's going into each part that goes into another part that comes to become a cell phone or a grill for grilling outdoors or whatever it may be. And all that complexity in the supply chain and going from, say, a basic chemical or a basic component into a part into a system, like a cell phone, it just adds even more complexity. And then when you top that off with high demand during COVID and low labor and complex supply systems, well, what you wind up with is bottlenecks everywhere. Bottlenecks at the ports, bottlenecks with trucks, bottlenecks with truckers, bottlenecks with warehouses, just bottlenecks everywhere throughout that entire chain. And so supply is low, demand is high. So guess what happens? You get a lot of inflation, which we're experiencing right now. And there's some things that the government can do about that, relative to interest rates and the Fed. But there are other things, they're going to be limited in their ability to fix that. That has to be fixed in many cases at a local level. And some of those fixes may take months, if not years. So I think we're going to be stuck with this so-called supply chain problem issue for quite some time to come, for the next year, I would guess anyways, as the demand and the supply sort of work their way through the system to create some sort of balance. And so what does that lead to? Well, inflation, usually leads to demand for higher wages. And you got a short supply, you got folks leaving their work to go to different jobs because of higher wages, which creates even more disruption in the economy and in the supply chain. So there you go. It's a bit of a mess. And we're just going to have to let it work its way out. As maybe the government can, add truck drivers through the National Guard to some of those places, and maybe they can, set some expectations about 24/7 shifts and so on and so forth. But I think we're going to be stuck with this for some time to come. So let me pause there and see if anybody has questions. I don't know. There's a couple of folks I see on the marker, Kim, Suzanne, or Alan. Did I pronounce that right? I don't know. Any questions or comments from anybody? Does that make sense? My little ranting on about, Kim. I think you're not turned on there. All right, let's carry on. And if you have a question or anything, feel free to interrupt or type it in or whatever it may be. I'm just checking to see. I don't see any messages right now. So with all that in mind, given the complexity. All right, so we had a little blibbit in our internet connection, so we're back. And when we left off, what I think I was saying was that we're going to get into a couple of models for supply chain management. I did have a question about the mess in Los Angeles where folks are breaking into boxcars and stealing stuff, and maybe we should call out the guard for that. And maybe we should. The problem that I would speculate on that is that the guard is only legally obliged to do certain tasks, and that may not be one of them. But that seems to me to be a problem relative to the folks who are doing the shipping, the folks who own the box cars, the folks who own the stockyard, and the local authorities and police. And they have to put their heads together to address that issue. The second question related to some ships are sitting at port when other ships have capacity to take them in. And I'm guessing here, but I would guess that they don't go to those other ports because they've made a calculation that the demurrage and inventory carrying costs for sitting at that port for a longer period is less than the cost of, traveling on up to the next port and then paying that port to unload and then finding and paying other truckers or transport systems to get that stuff back to what was intended to be the original destination. So those are all fairly complex issues around which, there are limited solutions, it seems to be. So I reckon we'll work our way through this. So with all that said, let's talk a little bit about a couple of models that I wanted to share with you. And again, this is stuff that I've picked up from other folks. I'm not the expert. And the first model is from a guy named Robert Parker. And he considers a supply chain to be three things: a supplier, a manufacturer, and a customer. Those are the three pieces in his supply chain model. And the point of his model is you're going to try to improve the efficiency of the chain by having each of the elements in that chain improve their performance and collaborate with each other so that you minimize the costs to the chain. So, in his model, you're going to apply these principles to try to minimize what the total chain cost, and you're going to focus on your customer satisfaction and their profit, your supplier profits and satisfaction, and your profits. So that can be a fairly complex issue. So what are you doing? Well, you're looking at the chain relative to cycle times, inventory levels, distribution requirements, costs, and a little bit more nebulous one, risks and delays. And then you're going to work to optimize the chain, as they say. So how do you do that? Well, the issues that you might address, now these are the ones that he mentioned. You may have others that you want to bring to play. The first one is designability. How easy is it to design? What kind of energy, effort, cost do you need to put into that? The next one is producibility. You've designed it, but you can't make it, or it's hard to make, or it costs a lot to make, that sort of thing. The next one is affordability. Well, can your customers, do they want it at that price with those features and benefits and so on? And last one is, saleability. Can you sell it? Or are you going to have to create a whole new distribution and sales network for it? And there may be other issues as appropriate for the supply chain that you're interested in. So how do we do this? Well, in each of the three elements, and by the way, the supplier and the customer, there may be one or two or three or more of those. So you're going to pick, some of the more important folks, and you're going to work with them first, and you might work with others later. So, but let's just, for simplification process, let's just pick three: supplier, manufacturer, producer, and customer. So each one of those entities appoints a representative, if you will, for those issues, designability, producibility, and so on. So there's a rep from each one. And then each one of those guys works with the other people in the chain to try to optimize the chain relative to those issues. And each in trying to make decisions about these things. And then, sorry, let me back up a little bit. So you got on each of the, whatever it is, 3 or 4 issues, you got a representative that's focused on that with the other members of the chain. And you'll thrash and bash and come to some conclusion about certain issues. Then those representatives have to put their entire, group together so that you play off of things like designability, affordability, and so on. Now, it's a bit, difficult, complex to get everybody to agree. And so I asked Bob, I said, well, what if you got one stickler out there of whatever 9 or 12 people on the team that just doesn't want to play? He said, well, decisions require that each team member be at least 70% satisfied with the team's decision and direction. Doesn't have to be 100%, but has to be somewhere in the range of 70, and you keep working on it. And then the peer pressure, apparently, he said, takes over when you got a stickler, somebody that doesn't want to play in your sandbox. So, but in the net, decisions are focused on meeting or exceeding the needs of the ultimate customer in the chain. So the ultimate customer in the chain takes priority. Now, some other things, team members are committed to cooperation. That doesn't mean they always agree on everything, but they are going to cooperate and respect one another's opinion and so on. So next point, just going off my notes here, competencies. They're going to use each member of the supply chain, you're going to use their competencies relative to achieving certain objectives. And you're going to try to give more attention to longer term benefits as to short term issues and costs. And you're going to have some common measures of success, so you can agree on that. And there's going to be a sharing of competitive issues within the enterprise. So that's his model. And I've simplified it just a bit. Of course, I reckon he's written a book about this. So if you really want to get chapter and verse, you can get that. Now, he says the benefits range anywhere from 20 to 70% in quality improvement, because you're looked at all the elements in the chain, you come up with an optimal or a better solution at the very least. 30 to 90% shorter cycle times, 50 to 30% waste reduction, and a 3-fold or more in technology gains, because you're sharing with each other the different techniques and methods and so on that you're going to be using. And so you gain through that interface and that collaboration a greater knowledge on how to satisfy the customer, how to work with your supplier and so on. So the benefits, according to Bob, the 1/3 goes to the customer, 1/3 goes to you if you're the manufacturer, and then the last third is split amongst your suppliers. And if you only got one, then they get 1/3 of it. So, and none of these numbers are hard and fast, but notionally, everybody has to benefit. Otherwise, you won't get much cooperation and collaboration. So, and he had a couple of case studies that he took us through, and it was all quite good stuff. Now, the other point that he made, let's see, is that the one? No. The other point that he made was that you got quite a bit of improvement, throughout the chain in terms of increased profits, increased sales, and so on and so forth. So with that said, I want to talk about Martin Christopher's supply chain. Okay. Now, his focus is on sorting through and rationalizing particular products and or customers. Okay. And so if you're a supplier, a manufacturer in this case, is the way I think of this, then here's a methodology for addressing that. So now he says, though, that the focus is on the customer, the ultimate customer, aligning products and services to them and working from them back into your company and as necessary back into your suppliers. Okay. And key in all is to understand all the costs associated with a supply chain, not just manufacturing costs. So you got inventory costs, you got distribution costs, you've got sales and interface costs, you've got post support costs and all that. So, and I guess kind of a philosophical point is you want to centralize strategy and policies, but you want to manage the deployment locally. So anyways, so where do we start this? Well, the way he starts is he starts out with listing your products and customers according to an A, a B, and a C list. Now you might have D. I mean, it's up to you. This is just a simplified, discussion. So let's suppose you've got an A list. Well, in your A list of your products and or customers, 20% of your products or customers provide 80% of your sales or profits. Now we'll break that down further in just a minute. Your B list, well, about 50% of your products or customers provide about 15% of your sales or profit. So, and then the C list, about 30% of your products or customers provide about 5% of your sales or profit. So, and it may not come out exactly to those numbers, but the point is you want to identify where you have the most sales, the most customers, and so on. And you want to use that to prioritize your resources relative to your business. So now, let's next step down. We're going to take the products and the customers, and we're going to create a little matrix. Okay, a little matrix. And on the vertical axis, we've got the products A, 80%, or 20% provides 80% of your sales or profit. The B's, 50 and whatever it was, 15, and the C's. Now, on the horizontal axis, you've got customers. So products, customers. So let's take an example. The A products, lots of profit and sales. The A customers, right? You're going to work real hard. Those are your key accounts. And you're going to work real hard to protect those. All right. Now, what about the B's? You got B products and, well, let's take another example. You got B products and A customers. Well, you're going to work to develop those. Or you got A products and B customers. You're going to work to develop those. What about the B's? Where both A and the product and the customer are B's. Well, you're going to work to maintain those. Well, what about the C's? You got C products and C customers. Well, you ought to drop those, or at least give them a hard look. And if their products aren't selling much, they're selling to customers that don't provide much benefit. Yeah, there ought to be a future there, or you ought to get rid of it. So let's take it down to the next level on the products. So on the vertical axis, we got volume by SKU. On the horizontal axis, we got profit. So we're getting down to the next level of detail. So what if it's a low profit but a high volume? Well, you probably need to work on reducing your production costs somehow. Identify those wherever they may be occurring and work on those. Well, suppose you got high profit and high volume. Well, you better give those priority. You need really high availability of those. Those are way up in the queue. Well, suppose you've got high profit and low volume. Well, you might want to put those into some sort of just-in-time delivery in manufacturing be lower priority, but you might want to squeeze those in between there with something. On the other hand, suppose it's low profit and low volume. Well, that's another one of those you ought to consider getting rid of if it doesn't have a future. So there's that. Now, last one on the customer profitabilities, talking about net sales versus cost of service. Now, this is all cost, and we'll come to that in just a minute. Well, if you got a low cost of service and a high net sales, well, that looks really important to me. Low cost of service, high sales, that's highly profitable. So you need to protect that. It goes back into the protect bucket. Well, what if it's high cost of service and high volume? Well, that deserves maybe some cost engineering and review, kind of like some of the previous ones. Well, what about low cost and low volume? Well, that might be something you want to give more attention to build that up so that eventually it's a higher volume and a higher profitability. And again, high cost, low volume, you probably want to look at eliminating that. So, any comments or questions on any of that so far? It's been, if I had, if I had a bit of a PowerPoint projector, this will probably be more obvious. But like I said, I'm going to send Kim these, and you guys can have a look at them at your leisure. Any comments or questions from anybody? Does any of that make sense? I hope. Anyways, so what are some of the costs of service? What is it costing you for this? Well, of course, you got your production costs, and people pay a lot of attention to that. In fact, maybe sometimes too much, particularly regards to, for example, labor costs. In most of the manufacturing operations I've been in, labor costs amount to something on the order of 15% of total costs. Sometimes it's as low as 5, sometimes it's as high as maybe 30 or so. But now I want you to think about that. If your labor costs only represent, say, 15% of your total costs, the real question you ought to be asking yourself is, what can I do to make my labor more efficient and more productive so that I reduce the other 85% of my costs, as opposed to doing, what some people like to do, cost cutting. If I could get a 5% improvement in the 85, that would be a lot more than a 10% reduction in labor. And not only that, if I reduce the 10% in labor, I get what amounts to a 1.5% savings in labor costs. But what's going to happen to the 85% of my costs in terms of throughput and efficiencies and yields and all that sort of thing? So I think you need to be really careful about just focusing on labor costs. So what are some of the other costs? Well, order processing, inventory carrying costs, packaging and shipping, interplant freight and handling, outbound freight, commissions, pre-sale servicing, post-sale servicing. You have all these other costs that need to be incorporated into, your total cost model in your supply chain. So anyways, that's another really, important set of points. Now, he says, a good supplier, what's some characteristics of a good supplier? Well, they're willing to work in a partnership or an alliance with you. They're committed to continuous improvement. They're accepting of innovation and change. They focus on throughput time reduction, quality management, benchmarking, flexible and helping design system logistics, and they share some common core values. I think that's a really important one. And they actively seek to improve communication, and they emphasize the primacy of quality and cost management. So that's probably, enough on all that. the overall objective here, of course, is to improve the efficiency through the supply chain by each member of the chain working collectively to a common purpose, such that you ultimately get the product in the most cost-effective way to your ultimate customer. So that's my 2 cents worth on supply chain management. Like I said, yeah, we're going to run it a little bit short today because I got nobody to bounce it off of. So we'll conclude there unless you have some questions. So
I do have just a few questions that have come in while you're presenting. One is saying, do you think they're getting their cost with prices up, the laborers out there?
Say the question again.
Yep, you got it. Do you think they are getting their cost prices up? And I think to elaborate, with less laborers out there.
Well, fewer laborers, for example, are going to, in many cases, if not most, all cases, are going to reduce the ability to supply. With that reduced supply, with the demand like it is, then that's going to drive up competitive bidding for the supply. And it might not be literally competitive, but folks will figure a way to make the most profit on, something that's in short supply. So that's, in my view, at least, that's part of what's driving up the cost to us as consumers. It's what's driving up the cost of some of this, because the supply is limited, because the labor supply is limited. And there are probably other factors. I'm, like I said, I'm not an expert, but that's one of the first things that comes to my mind. So I don't know if I've answered your question, though.
I think you have. We hadn't gotten any responses on it just yet. Now, this other question came in is they're just a little curious if you've ever seen a supply chain issue like this, which is affecting many sectors currently. They're saying they remember the gas shortage in the 70s and then are a little bit joking about the Tonight Show with Jimmy Carlson making a joke that toilet paper was running out and may have started a panic and the shortage.
Have I ever seen anything like this? No. I'm old, but I'm not that old. So this is relatively new. Now, the gasoline shortage, I think, was driven by OPEC. They conspired, reduced the supply, people panicked, they started buying extra. The toilet paper shortage was what I think was prompted by folks hoarding. So they were worried that, that the supply wouldn't be there. So they went out and bought, 3 Costco cases of toilet paper. Well, if they're hoarding 3, that means there are 2 that aren't available to you and me to buy, say, over at Kroger's. And the same thing is true for the, for the sanitation products, the hand sanitizer and the wipes and all that sort of thing. So one was a supply issue, in my view, the gasoline demand, and the other was a demand issue, that is hoarding. And at this point, we've got kind of a different situation, I think, wherein the supply of labor is throughout the world is relatively lower and the demand for the products is relatively higher. So it's creating all kinds of, supply demand disconnects. And another issue that I didn't mention earlier is, we've worked, most companies over the past 30 years or so that I've observed have worked really hard to keep their inventory levels low. And because, excuse me, that's working capital that's not available to you to finance projects, to make payroll. And so, if, that money, you have to borrow money to make your other obligations from time to time and use the inventory to guarantee the payment ultimately. So when that happens, right, then you end up with what might be a mismatch relative to the disruptions in the supply chain, because your inventories are low. So when people start hoarding, or when the supply is reduced, that inventory goes even lower and you don't have any, and you got lots of demand. And so that's going to put pressure on prices again. So that, not accounting for potential political or global, in this case, disruptions, also creates, difficulties in the supply chain. And what we're seeing today, I think, in the US is a move relative to these global issues, is a move to increase the supply domestically, as opposed to relying, for example, on necessarily on Taiwan or China to provide chips for automobiles, because China may not be a very reliable supplier these days because of the political issues that are, rising their ugly head. So, you're probably going to see an increase in domestic manufacturing and an increase in inventory levels. So what's that going to do with higher labor costs and higher inventory levels? That's going to push prices up even more. But you got a choice here. Would you rather have it and pay more, or would you rather not have it when you want it? And so most people want to have it, and so they're going to pay more. Then they're going to go back to their employer and demand more to offset the inflation for what they just paid more for. It's a complex issue. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Well, thank you so much, Ron, for another great conversation today. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap things up?
No, hang in there. We'll eventually get through this COVID thing, and I think prices will eventually stabilize. It may take a year or two. In the meantime, just hang in there and do the best you can to manage what you've got. And don't be too fussy about it. We will get through this somehow.
Yes, very well said, Ron. Well, great. Thank you for your time and another great session. On behalf of the entire team here at Mobius Connect, thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us today too. Just as a quick reminder, you can see past episodes of Connect Conversations on YouTube, and we will share a link to subscribe to our YouTube channel in an email following this webinar. Be on a lookout. We do run these typically every other Tuesday at 2 p.m. Our next one up will be Tools the RCM. And like Doug said, he does have some show notes available for us. So if you would like to receive in those, please email our team at info@mobiusconnect.com, and we will make sure we send those over to you. If you are interested in engaging with other industry professionals or would like to participate on the industry's live feed and forums on Mobius Connect, you can visit www.mobiusconnect.com to create your free profile. And be sure to follow us on social media at Mobius Connect to stay up to date with all the latest community happenings. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day. Please stay safe, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, guys. Later.